outfits through which they hope to chart a path to power. Also in the Standard, we have MPs stand probe into Gravy train. Remember, the National Assembly's PIC joins a growing list of House committees that after months-long inquiries recommend further investigations. That and more that we'll be dissecting shortly. But I want us to just take a look at the headline of the Daily Nation. And the headline that they are running with is "The Good Doctor Who Killed His Children." Remember, James Gakara was always jovial, according to his employees and friends. We'll be looking at that story, together with now the fact that the High Court has halted General Badi's cabinet march. The High Court quashed President Kenyatta's decision to co-opt Nairobi Metropolitan Service Director General Mohamed Badi into the cabinet. Justice Anthony Murima yesterday declared that President Kenyatta's decision was in contravention of the Constitution, illegal and voids ab initio from the beginning. Now, let's just start with the Standard. But before we do, let me just introduce my guest this morning. We have Professor Gitile Naituli, who is the former NCIC Commissioner, together with George Kithi, who is a lawyer. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us here on Morning Express. Now, let's start with that story on the Standard. That is the headline on the uncertainty of Jubilee and collapse of NASA that has been scattering. And we'll go to page 4 of that newspaper. It is the rush to register new parties that will change arena ahead of the elections, that is the 2022 general elections. Prof, maybe I'll start with you. The Register of Political Parties says 83 parties are likely to participate in next year's general elections. What are the implications of this, if there are any?
Well, there's no implication. Kenyans are brilliant. They know how to win through that and pick the people they want. But the big picture is this. We have failed as the democratic experiment is actually failing. The idea was to have national parties which believe in a certain agenda and they push that agenda. We have failed to have parties properly managed away, even from the politicians. So the rush to register parties, because the parties belong to individuals. And therefore, you feel that if you are not close to Ruto, you will not get the UNDA nomination, so you need your own party so that you can get your own nomination. If you are not close to Raila Odinga, you fear that the ODM won't nominate you, so you need to register a party or find some party that may nominate you. Personalizing parties is a huge weakness in party management. And that is the reason why there is all this clamor. The other reason is because we simply don't believe in anything. Parties supposed to carry an ideology. They are supposed to carry aspirations of its members. So if it's a farmers' party, believes in serving the farmers, making sure they have good deals. If it's a labor party, it believes in fair labor practices, and so on. So what do these people believe in? Nothing. And therefore they can register as many parties as they wish.
Okay, I'll come to you, George. The professor has said democratic experiment is failing, and also the issue of ideology has been raised. But here we have Anne Nderitu, who is the Register of Political Parties, being quoted saying that we ask them why they cannot join other existing political parties, and the answer is always the same, that they want to bring a different idea on how the government should be done. So then why not bring those ideas into the parties that already exist?
I think that's a good observation. But this, I'll pick the issue. You see, elections have aspirations and interests that need to be taken care of. And I don't think, as Kenyans, we trust each other as communities and individuals in our own capacities and inputs, whether we can take care of each other's interests. This is because of the competitiveness that comes with the nature of elections that we've been holding over time and the experiences we've had. For instance, if you call for elections and every election cycle you're asking people to bias themselves and divide themselves within their confines of interest. For instance, the youth have their interests, the women have their interests, and so shall be different ethnic groups, and especially on ethnicity. I'll say this because ethnicity is the closest mode of divisions that we have when we go for election. It is the first port of call when we start looking at national interest and what our ethnic groups are getting. And therefore, if the closest and most dominant form of division in a democratic election is ethnicity, then we will divide ourselves based on those interests, and therefore the political parties eventually will take the ethnical or ethnocentric predilections in terms of what then the interest to be taken care of will be. Eventually, therefore, our political parties have taken the ethnic formations. For instance, if I ask you who is the dominant community in ODM, you will tell me. If I tell you who is the dominant community in Jubilee, you will tell me. If you ask me for ANC and Ford Kenya and other political parties. So suffice to put it that eventually what we are having are those foremost divisions being ethnic. Then the next thing is, of course, monetization of politics. Eventually, political parties at this time is the harvest time. They harvest because they sponsor candidates at nomination levels, at the general election levels, and within the context, they make money. And therefore, people are looking for opportunities, as will be in business, even if it means under trees and in briefcases, so that those political parties make money. And therefore, it is harvest time for many people in different areas as we participate in the election. So the interests are varied. The interests are many. There are those that are dominant and those that are small interests. But again, the packaging is through political parties. And therefore, the truth of the matter is we will continue for a very long time to see political parties that as many as will be the interest, so much so that people will participate in the election at their will. But most importantly, I join issue with the good professor. It is true, again, that the democracy, the experience we have with democracy is that we have not democratized our political parties. We have come from far. We've tried to make laws. We've tried to make the Political Parties Act. We put that in the Constitution. However, it is still not working for the reason that ethnicization of political parties is the dominant issue. Again, I repeat, for purpose of clarity, we shall not have one dominant political party or two or three, and we'll have many political parties because of the variant interests that needs to be taken care of in that context.
All right, Prof, coming back to you, because you say the democratic experiment has failed. So then, who is dropping the ball? Is it the people? Is it the governments, the people forming these parties?
Actually, it is. You couldn't easily blame the people because we are supposed to meant some consequences for the leaders. For example, what my colleague just said here, the people should know what they need is a good government, not the government from their tribe. I mean, Kiguyus, are they not suffering with us now? The president is a Kiguyu. So instead of us looking for a good government, meaning that we should look for a party which has internal, demonstrated capacity for internal democracy. That party is the party we should be supporting, but again, we don't. Although I want to say that this election may very well be different. There is 56% young people right now who really know. They are not tied to any tribe. That's my perception, because we did some research at the National Coalition, and they found that by and large, these young people are no longer into this tribe business, and these people may shock the leaders, because the leaders think they can still organize along tribal lines. They may get a shock this election. But before this election, I think my colleague is right. We packaged the people into tribal cocoons like sacks of potatoes, and they traded with one another, which is what they are still trying to do right now. That is why there is this tribal alliance. I invited some Luya here representing Kakamega, another Luya representing Mbukuzu, and then I try to get a Kamba representative. We are still thinking in that mode, but the 56% of young people have left that thinking. These are Kenyans looking for a government that delivers to all, regardless of which tribe the leader may come from.
Okay, so then, George, how do we speed up this process? Because Prof says this 2022 elections could maybe change, but then you've mentioned the fact that ethnicity is still a factor, monetization of politics is still another factor. How do we get away from that?
That's a good question. I think we need to be patient as a country. We can't help it. This is because There is a generational dominance that loots the country. There's a generational dominance that escalates politics and the political tempo through ethnicization. There is a generational dominance that doesn't care about certain things that we think are obvious and people would want them to be taken care of. But then that is because of the way they've been schooled and the life they've lived over time until such a time when they come into leadership and take up leadership and they lead the country in a certain way and fashion and style. But then one day, that generation won't be there. It is that new generation, as Professor has put it aptly, that then won't care about whether a person has come from a certain type of a family or whether that person comes from a certain tribe. And there is goodwill in that and an obvious estimation of time. We just need probably 15 to 20 years of a certain constant in trying to knock at the doors when we'll get good governance. Now, good governance will come when we elect a good man or woman who then leads the country not based on a certain bias, but bias for the goodwill of the people of Kenya. That will happen only when the person has not been brought up in certain ethnic biases. For instance, urbanization has caught up with us. The middle class has grown so much so that then what we need to do is increase the aspect and concept of middle class in terms of how they mingle and produce the next generation that is not necessarily ethnic based. If people continue to live in the manner that they lived and are ethnic based, then the decision will have a similar fashion and style and therefore outcome. But then when we have people who've lived in schools, have transited the country and have gone beyond the borders of ethnic groupings where they live, eventually we will have a mix of people whose perception of life is not the dominance of ethnic considerations, but then patriotism and the country and the good of the other person. That is a time that will transit. For now, I know we're beholden and chained to a certain generation. That is the factor that we need to continue to change. It's going to be grinding and slowly, but one day we'll get there. And I do believe that although this election will have a fashion of change and a tidbit of that change, we may not have it completely. But one day we're going to have a complete cleanup of what we think is ethnicization because of generational change.
All right, I want us to move on to page 6. And the story is about the fact that KANU is set to make a major announcement on 30th during the AGM. Now, the party seeks to return to power after 19 years. Prof, I'll come to you. Is this possible?
Oh, everything is possible. That's why we're having an election. But realistically, given the way the politics is shaping up, I think it's good if we can have one Kenya alliance, and then we have the Raila, and then we have Ruto. So we'll have 3 triads trying to compete for power, and maybe there will be more ideas we can harvest from when it's like that. That's why we like pluralism. Mm-hmm. But this election looks like is going to be. We are going for a second round. That's what I think. Because don't forget that Muturi also is running, the speaker. Central Kenya still has not produced a candidate. I mean, it has produced a candidate in the name of Muturi. So if everybody runs like it looks like, then we will go to second round. But otherwise, everything is possible. That's why there is an election. So the KANU can still produce a president.
Can we afford, as a country where we are right now, George, can we afford a second round, as Professor said?
Well, I don't think we have a lot of luxury on expenditure of our resources given the economic situation. But I also think that democracy is not cheap. It's not cheap because we have put into place mechanisms for a second round. It must be envisaged, completely envisaged and planned and budgeted that we will have a second round anyway, notwithstanding that we have it or we don't have it. This is because it is envisaged. So in terms of planning and budgeting, we must express ourselves in terms of the previous experience. Yes, we had a second round. And secondly, that it's possible to have a second round, so it must be budgeted that we'll have an election and another. And it's possible to have a first and a second and a third, depending on circumstances, looking at the law as it provides. So we must contest and contest until we get the person who then has been elected by the people. But I think looking at this issue holistically, it gives me a certain other thought process that probably is coming out. You see, I do not know why there is a sequence of pronouncements and there is also a pattern on how people are organizing themselves. I thought ODM was more organized than KANU in terms of its national dominance and the way it has held its national delegates conferences and so on and so forth. But then KANU comes first, then there are others that are going to come later. Now, the pronouncement of the first may have an implication on the subsequent pronouncement. Is it possible, therefore, that the participation and the cooperation of Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga has a bearing on the first time or the first in time in which KANU is going to pronounce itself as participating in the next general election? If so, then are the subsequent pronouncements as they will hold their delegates conferences and so on and so forth, make decisions as relates to the next general election, will they be mirroring on how KANU is going to pronounce itself, like endorsements or so on and so forth? So it's possible, therefore, that there could be a pattern that's going to emerge because of how the conferencing and the decision as to next election are going to be made in the different political parties as will be national to sponsor a presidential candidate. But I do think that it is the KANU's move is deliberate, it is planned, and it has a bearing on how the elections, especially the presidential elections, is going to be held next year. All
right, another story that has been making headlines and criticism has been, reactions and criticism have been going round is the fact that the High Court has barred Badi from cabinet meetings. Now, this happened yesterday, that the Nairobi High Court locked Director General of Nairobi Metropolitan Services, Major General Mohammed Badi, out of the cabinet. I'll start with you, George, because you're a lawyer. This was expected, wasn't it?
It was expected. There have been warnings here and there in which the High Courts have invalidated decisions by the President and government. But I want to say this, that there are many things the President has done and may want to do that are good. Good because they seem to be working here and there. But then you cannot do, unfortunately, what you want, be it good or bad, if it is not anchored in law. The Constitution is very simple. Either you have the power to exercise or you do not have the power to exercise. Either power is donated to you or is not donated to you by law. So you don't wake up and do what you want. You wake up and do what you've been told to do by the law. And therefore, if you do the good or the bad, but then it is not within confines of law or supported by law, then you are walking outside your mandate. We call it ultra vires in law. And therefore, the President, the context as to whether what he did was good or bad is not the issue in law. Unfortunately, we look at the process. Did you then have powers to appoint? Because the law prohibits military people to go outside the confines of their military calling. For instance, you can't say that a military person goes to work in a place where civilians work. We separate you from civilians because you're in military. And therefore, I think it is possible that we have a fusion of civilian life and military life if the law says as much. For instance, I think the Kenya Meat Commission was a good thing to have the military run it, but it was illegal because the law doesn't allow the military to run it. Even if it runs into profitability, we then need to make laws to allow the president, allow the military to run certain enterprises. And therefore, it is either the law or nothing. If you want to do something, do it within the confines of law. You must be supported by law. That's the only way we can democratize our country and abide by the rule of law. As such, unfortunately, there are many good things all of us want to do. The law does not allow it, and we want to do them.
All right, Prof, coming to you, and we're having this conversation earlier on, the fact that we wait as a country, we have this, you know, I don't want to call it a bad habit per se, but we know something is not done right, but we let it go on months down the line, because he has been in this position for months now, and then all of a sudden we discover that it's not right.
Well, I think we always have a desire to violate the laws here in this country. I think the lawyers explained extremely well that we need to look at the law against actions that you took when we have responsibility. And I think there was time for the president to fix this. First of all, let me say, personally, I support the president's appointment of military officers. And this is my reasons. If you look at the countries which are developed, are countries that use the military establishment, because these fellows' training is such that once you give them an assignment, they must accomplish it or quit. There's no two way about it. Number two, the corruption has been a culture in this country. The military has been spared of that corrupt culture to an extent. I'm not saying 100%, but to a very large extent. And you can see that the appointment has delivered to the citizens of Nairobi. But the point is the president needs to do things legally. That is the point. So before he made the appointment, he should have moved some laws in the parliament, as long as they are not against the constitution, to allow him to do that. So you can't just appoint some guy and make him sit in the cabinet. The cabinet is limited to 22. Now you are already having 23 or something like that. It's the same thing I've wondered why Nombonde ever went to court to challenge Tunju's being a cabinet minister when he's Secretary General of our party. Because the law says you cannot use national resources to promote the party. That's equivalent to using national resources, because the fellow is a Secretary General of the ruling party. So he should never, I think someone should have gone to court to seek clarification whether that person should have sat in the cabinet, even though he's a minister without portfolio. That's irrelevant. The point is he's a minister with all the benefit of being a minister when he is Secretary General of our party. So we have this peasant to do things without following the law. I don't know where it comes from. I think it's probably because our laws were unwritten, strictly enforced, because they were cultural, they were socio. We will isolate you if you don't follow the laws. So these laws came here from Europe. We have not internalized them, because in Europe, laws are worshipped. You violate the law, you face the consequences right there. It's like God. So here, we don't seem to there's a nostalgia about the One Party era, where the president basically got away with anything that he did. And we're fortunate here, because if you look at the Kibaki administration, Kibaki ruled this country with the old constitution, but he is a national hero. He followed the law to the letter. But I guess, just like Justin Muturi was saying the other day, there's a nostalgia emerging of wanting absolute power by the current leadership, and that is why the courts seem to be speaking, and very strongly, for the rule of law.
Okay. Now, George, once again, the president has been found in the wrong side of the law. What picture does this paint, especially on the Attorney General?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't envy the president. I don't envy the Attorney General. This is the reason. I want to look at the president's mind and see why he did what he did before I come to what then would consolidate the thinking now. The president has lamented publicly that corruption, he has tried to fight corruption. There is no other regime that has tried to fight corruption than this one, yet he's failing. Then he finds a window where he can use the military because of their command structure and the fact that theirs is a science, and therefore you either do it or you don't do it, like the good professor has explained. And therefore he seems to be able to move things faster, and I think with more order, because he orders them to do, and they must do it, and he can supervise them. In any event, he's the commander-in-chief. And therefore, the military is a good and better option where patriotism is found much more subsisting than in the civilian, than from the civilians. Now, fast forward is that when he co-opted the military into his role, and therefore the project that he intends to do, remember there's an entire system that falls under the Constitution. Laws on how public finances are going to be administered, the offices that are going to be responsible, an entire audit structure that has been put into law, and therefore that seems to have a friction with the existing laws, which have not been changed. Therefore, it was going to be impossible to completely continue gloriously to use the military through and through, and to even bring them to cabinet without that friction with the law. And that is where we've ended up, to a screeching halt, at least with the law. But then when we come to the advisors, I think the advisors have continuously, persistently, consistently failed the president, from BBI to any other appointment that has been invalidated by law. And it is because they listen to the president as a client, they did not listen to the president as a sponsor of information for the people of Kenya. The people that need to be serviced are the people of Kenya and not the president. And therefore you look at the president as the Attorney General, not as your client, but as a person who then needs to be regulated in the context of the power of the people of the Republic of Kenya, who then derive their power and have donated it to the president through the Constitution. As such, it is impossible for the Attorney General to give service to the president. He must give service to the people. The moment he starts thinking of the people of Kenya as for or against an idea of the president, whatever he wants to do, good or bad, but within the law, then he'll get it right. For now, he's gotten it invariably wrong at every instance and corner. Okay. And us as lawyers will continue to regulate the executive, but we continue to blame the Attorney General for the failures that we continue to see, especially on obvious things such as co-opting a military officer into the cabinet. I think it is possible. Okay. I think there was no law or regulatory environment for that.
All right, Prof, it seems that you want something, you have something to say, but even as you say it, so then where does this leave Nairobi County?
Well, Nairobi County is a county. The law fixes it. You can't change it without a referendum. But I wanted to inject him because I agree with Kevin completely. Everything he has said, except the fighting corruption. He's saying this government has fought corruption more than any other. It hasn't. It has talked about fighting corruption. There's a difference between talking about fighting corruption and actually doing it. And I'm reminded of a beautiful executive order the president issued, Executive Order number 2 of 2018, which mandated the government department to post in a public website the tendering process and the reasons why they gave the tender to A and not B. And that executive order was ignored 100%. There was no consequences to anybody for ignoring. If that order was executed, has the president intended